committee. Appreciate everyone being with us this morning, and reminder that the next brunch is the last Sunday in February. That works out to be February 27th, at which time Rabbi Salem Pierce will be with us, the executive director of Carolina Jews for Justice, speaking on what's Jewish about social action. Today's talk, which I'm really looking forward to, is on the Wake Interfaith Disaster Team, who they are, what they do, and I did not even know we had a interfaith disaster team here. Our speaker is Larry Marks, was born and raised in the Midwest in Chicago, Illinois. Very strong volunteer ethic in his family, and in that part of the Midwest, very strong volunteer ethic. His mother, for example, was active in Girl Scouts and civil defense. While in the service, Larry led services in the local community and on alternate weeks for about 2 years. And after the military, we're back in the Midwest, served on the House Committee and his Temple Board for several years, was a three-year term as president. Larry moved to Raleigh in 1984 as part of a corporate transfer, served on the Temple Beth Or Outreach Committee and House Committee for several years, and was also Secretary of Jewish Family Services Board for 14 years. And Larry tells me that's where this story begins. Apparently, there's been an impressive amount of Jewish involvement in the interfaith disaster team. So I will turn it over to Larry and let him talk about that, the mission, the formation, the growth, the maturation of that group. I would only add Larry volunteered if there are questions along the way. If some of you know how, there's a way you can like raise your hand in Zoom, or you can just kind of wave your hand. We'll try to catch your question, or post it in the chat, and I'll make sure that all the questions posted in the chat are addressed at the end of the talk. So Larry, thank you for joining us this morning, and please proceed.
I sure will. Thanks for the opportunity to speak today. What we're going to talk about is long-term recovery, what it is, how our organization got founded, some of the early activities, the 2016 tornado, which some of you may remember here in Wake County, and subsequent activities. It's very interesting to run or work with a group like this because you're preparing for a big disaster, but there's not always one there. It's not like other kinds of community service where you can use the volunteers. So you have to work and think of activities or other things to do to keep people engaged and active. So we'll have a chance to look at that a little bit too. First thing people think of when they think about a disaster is the so-called response phase, the first few weeks after the disaster, where there's activities going on like to repair and rebuild homes for people whose needs aren't covered by insurance, homeowner assets, and government grants and low interest loans. Those people need assistance, and that turns out to really be the big goal of an agency like this, how to help those people. That can mean rebuilding a house, and it's not just necessarily the rebuild. A lot of the disasters that happened in North Carolina involve flooding, And that means ripping out the floors, the walls up to above the flood stage, and the insulation, flooring, all the upholstered furniture, mattresses, all the appliances, not only the little ones, but the furnace, the air conditioning, and the major appliances, washer, dryer, refrigerator. This can turn out to be a really big deal, and a lot of people don't have flood insurance. They don't think that they're not in what's designated as a flood zone, and they have no idea that their homeowner policy isn't going to cover them. So work like that is assistance like that is given by or organized by groups like Wake Interfaith Disaster Team and other long-term recovery groups, as they're called. Here's how I got into this. Sid gave a sort of an introduction of it with how I've been used to volunteering. As it happens, when we moved here, we were involved at Bethor. We became interested in volunteering for the Federation, and I was on the Family Services Board for a long time. Rob Hubble, who some of you may know, was the president of Family Services at that time, and I realized that every time that the bylaws were amended, they were noted in the minutes, and they were well documented, but no one had ever gone back to update the master copy. So there was no quick way to see what the real operational rules were. He took it upon himself to go through 14 years of monthly minutes and find all the bylaws amendments and update the bylaws themselves. And then he called me up and said, "Hey, you've been the secretary for a long time. They really like you. We really like you because your minutes are so detailed, but you can't be secretary anymore. You've had way too many terms. The bylaws say you can only have 2. And he says, I'm letting you loose." I wasn't exactly brokenhearted, but there I was. And then 3 months later, something happened that completely changed my volunteerism. Let's back up to this was in 2002 when Rob said I have to leave the board. Back in 1999, Hurricane Floyd struck in eastern North Carolina. Some of you longtime residents may remember that. It was a storm of record. The soil was already heavily saturated from Hurricane Dennis. And as you know, our whole state runs downhill. Mountains at one end, sea level at the other. And what happens, it happened in Hurricane Matthew too, is the hurricane brings a heavy offshore wind, and you have a storm front coming in from the west. And instead of coming through with heavy rains for an hour, the hurricane holds it off, and it rains in one place for hours and hours. In fact, 15 inches of rain fell at some places. It collects in the little tiny streams and then the creeks and then flows into the rivers. And so the hurricane goes through and passes and is long gone, while all of this water is in the western part of the state being funneled into larger and larger streams. And all of a sudden it comes to the east, and you get floods in the east under clear blue skies 10 days after the hurricanes passed through. And that's what happened in Floyd. It was record. In fact, nearly every river basin in eastern North Carolina exceeded what was the 500-year flood zone, 500-year flood levels. And it isn't the coastal counties that get hit by the hurricane. It's the second or third tier of counties in. And that's what happened with Hurricane Floyd. Hadn't had a big flood like that or a big hurricane like that in North Carolina in decades. North Carolina Council of Churches realized that they had to do something. And so they formed a group called North Carolina Interfaith Disaster Response. In those days, almost all the disaster response and disaster recovery was done by faith-based groups. It's not so much anymore these days. And some of the secular nonprofit organizations have gotten involved. But all of the older groups, you can tell because interfaith is in their name someplace. And that included this statewide group that they formed. They brought in a lady named the Methodist minister named Carolyn Tyler. She'd done extensive disaster recoveries in the Gulf Coast area in Alabama, and said, we need you to be the statewide executive director of our new organization, North Carolina Interfaith Disaster Response, and manage this recovery from Hurricane Floyd. And so her job was to teach the counties that were affected how to do what Wake Interfaith later on was taught to do, to carry on a long-term disaster recovery. So they based her in Eastern North Carolina and Aden. And for 3 years, and you may remember this, the Sunday newspaper would have pictures of the people still in trailers after 2 or 3 years, waiting for home repairs and housing to be built for them. Finally, it did finish in 2002. There was still some money left, so they kept Reverend Tyler on as the director and moved her to Raleigh. In fact, an office on Six Forks Road, to continue to run the organization, but be closer to North Carolina Emergency Management, which is based in Raleigh, and there was a lot of interaction going on, and more centrally located in the state, because we get floods in the west and hurricanes and tornadoes in the central and western parts of the state too. So she found herself in Wake County in 2002, right about the time that I exited the Family Services Board, and wondered if she could form an interfaith long-term recovery group in a county in the absence of a disaster. This was her grand experiment. And so she went around recruiting people, and she took the word interfaith very seriously. It didn't mean a bunch of different Protestant denominations. She found a Sikh, she found a Jain and a Muslim, as well as the more prominent denominations. And eventually that brought her around to the Jewish Federation. And she knocked on the door, and she wound up talking to Sandy Crane. You probably remember Sandy. And Sandy said, I think I've got just the person for you. He used to work on our Family Services Board. And sure enough, Judah and Sandy called me, Judah Siegel, everybody remembers Judah, right? They called me to a meeting and said, since you're off the Family Services Board and don't have anything to do now, we've got a great assignment for you. We know you're a hands-on person and you'd rather be involved out in the field than doing something like Bible study or hospital visits. So this is what we want you to do. And that is how I got tapped for Family Services Board. So once Reverend Tyler had several of us lined up, it was about 30 at the beginning. She borrowed a room from the Salvation Army and called us together for a meeting. And she sat us down and talked to us for an hour and said, this is what a long-term recovery group is. This is how you have to form. And these are the things you need to be able to do. And then she released us and said, come back next month. We're going to talk about this some more. And we did it again. And then we did it again. And then she said, okay, we're done. You're on your own, but I'm expecting you to get together and really get a strong long-term recovery group found. So off we went. Now this was something that really surprised me. In the Midwestern schools that I went to, Robert's Rules of Order was taught in great detail. We actually practiced it. Every classroom had regular classroom meetings that had to be done in strict accordance with Robert's rules. The teacher was the parliamentarian and insisted on it. And we elected a student council who also, with representatives from each classroom, and they also executed parliamentary procedure at their meetings. So as after Reverend Tyler let us go, it turns out I was the only one who knew Robert's Rules of Order. So I was elected the temporary president, sent off to create the bylaws and articles of incorporation, apply for a 501c3, and form the organization. That's how I got involved at the beginning. Now, those of you that know Judith know that one of his highest priorities was community visibility. You know, Judith was always making sure that we were in front of the school board, in front of the newspaper, and so on. And not necessarily a bad thing. He saw this as another vehicle for public presence. So he gave us the conference room at the Federation for our monthly meetings. And when officers were elected, he even agreed to be treasurer. One of the early founders was Roberta Blumberg. You may know her. I think everybody knows her. Okay. Well, after a little bit of time, things changed. The North Carolina Interfaith Disaster Response expended their funds. It's really hard to raise funds when there's no disaster, so Reverend Tyler moved on. But the volunteer group that we had formed continued. Oh, the group that inherited North Carolina Interfaith Disaster Response morphed into a different group with a secular name because, as I said, there was a movement towards removing interfaith from the name and inviting secular organizations. They continued to host quarterly meetings, and that was very helpful because that was our source of training. We could attend those meetings, find out what other people was done, listen to the and learn from the recoveries of other disasters and other floods and hurricanes and tornadoes in other parts of the state. That new organization was called North Carolina Voluntary Organizations in Disaster, NCVOED for short. But back to Wake Interfaith. It didn't take us very long to figure out that it's pretty hard to recruit people and keep them interested and active for a disaster that might not come for years. So we started looking at other things we could do. It's also hard to attract people when the only thing you have to offer them is training in how to shingle a roof or tarp a roof or plaster a wall. Not very wide scope of people that are interested in learning that. So we started looking for other activities. One of the things that we found by working with Wake County's emergency management groups was that there could be a need for shelter workers. That a lot more people are able to do that. The work is pretty easy. You circulate around the shelter, talking to people. They're in shock. They really need somebody to just listen to their stories. Sit down with them, bring some water, maybe some bottles of water, listen to the story. If you sense that there's someone that's really in serious trouble, you can get them the help they need from someone with more training. So we started training shelter workers. We actually held 5 classes over the next couple of years, next 10 years or so. The very first one was held at Beth Meyer. Roberta helped organize it. It was an interesting relationship with the county. We were getting one liaison from emergency management, one from the fire department, and one from Wake County Human Services, which is the social services organization. The advice to do the shelter workers actually came from the human services representative. Time marched on, still no disaster, but training and awareness continued. We increased our relationship with North Carolina, the statewide organization, North Carolina Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. The Federation remodeled its conference room to make offices, so we lost our conference room, but Temple Beth Orr was happy to let us use one of the classrooms during midweek. And by then, our steady, regular attendees at the meetings had dwindled to small enough size that the classroom worked fine for us. Moving on, probably most of you remember the April. Am I speaking loud enough? Are you able to hear me? Okay, good. April 16th was the date of a widespread tornado outbreak, not only across North Carolina, but several other states. Sure, many of you remember that. The tornado that struck Wake County was just one of those 8 in the state. It started as a EF3 tornado in Moore County. That's mid-scale from 1 of 5, and varied between EF0 and EF2 as it went from Holly Springs in southwest Wake County to Rollsville in northeast Wake County. I was, regularly meeting with the state organization, and they had a meeting shortly after the disaster, and said to discuss how the long-term recovery was going to go, and what organizations were going to be available to do which things. I asked the Wake County people to step aside and asked if any of the others wanted to be the long-term recovery group or lead the organization. Nobody stepped forward, so I said, Wake Interfaith is going to do it. And that's what we did. That's what we did. But we were fortunate in a number of ways. Now, I'm going to go into some detail in a minute, but one of the things that was fortunate, loss of life in Wake County was minimal. There were 4 deaths. I don't know if you remember them. But most of the homes that were damaged were relatively new construction. Wake's in this huge boom, as you can't help but know. And so that the new homes were all mortgaged, and the mortgage meant they were fully insured. So fortunately to limit the size of the unmet needs, those people were fully covered. We were fortunate, and we'll see why in a bit, that Wake Interfaith was fully formed and had already had some training. We were fortunate in that the community and agencies outside the community were very generous with donations. And we were fortunate that several agencies that Wake Interfaith hadn't worked with previously stepped forward and said, we want to ally with you. One of the things that happened, it was a little funny, was that we did get a visit from two agencies that had experience in disaster. We weren't sure we did, and they sat down with us and said, well, you're going to have write some bylaws and so on. And we said, oh, we've already got those done. So at least they were able to skip the first step and start with step 2. We brought in a volunteer team from Michigan to help us locate the boundaries of the disaster, so we knew what areas we were going to have to work in. They helped canvass the town. Around the same time, just after they'd started working, Wake County said, our GIS, Geographic Information System, is up and running. So we've taken the liberty of running a map for you that shows exactly where the scope of the damage is. And here's an Excel spreadsheet of all the homes with the names and addresses and phone numbers of the homeowners. So we used the group from Michigan to, they had not only helped confirm that, but they hung door tags on every house saying, if you have unmet needs that aren't covered by your homeowner insurance or assets or government loans and grants, call this number for help. So it was a terrific job for a way to get the word out, probably better than anything else we could have done. And that's one thing we learned. All of the practices said you need to do a damage assessment on foot, like this team had done. Since then, we've learned that now all the counties have GIS and you don't need to do it anymore. The biggest key area in disaster recovery is something called case management. It's sort of like social work case management, but it's not exactly the same. The case manager has to be satisfied that the damage is real, that the client really does own the house and not and have the title to it, that other sources of assistance have been exhausted and that unmet needs remain. There's and also to be watchful for what's politely called duplication of benefits and more clearly called double dipping. A case manager has to know the resources available to the client and has to be the client's advocate in dealing with insurance companies and with the government. For example, if a FEMA application is returned as inadequate, it comes as a 6-page document in fine print legalese. It isn't until the 4th page where they actually tell you that your application was returned because you forgot to put in the zip code. Let's face it, a lot of the clients do not have the reading level that we have, and just helping them through that, helping them through the paperwork is a huge part of the case management. So we needed case managers. Well, we were fortunate that we had a little bit of previous training from a case management trainer from the United Methodists. And we were able to call him up and arrange training for the very next week. We used that week to recruit about 25 people for the class. Some of them were going to be case managers. Some of them, like me, were going to be organizing case managers and wanted to understand the job so that we would be able to do our job well. Christ Episcopal Church found out about it and provided a huge meeting space for us. Catholic Charities joined the group. They offered office space for the folks from Michigan, and they provided a phone line answering system throughout the whole period of recovery for survivors to call. We were able to put that number on the hang tags. They offered to sit on the Unmet Needs Committee and fund cases that met their criteria. There are 2 reasons why a disaster recovery doesn't fully complete. One is they run out of volunteer labor, and the other is they run out of funds. We were fortunate that we didn't run out of either because the community was so generous, and because, as we'll see in just a bit, we were prepared and able to accept the volunteers when they popped up before any of the other groups were. Thanks to Carolyn Tyler setting us up 9 years earlier. 9 years earlier. So Catholic Charities joined. They sat on the Unmet Needs Committee. They had done a collection at their Sunday masses for the recovery from the Wake County disaster. And they later confided that when they did it, they didn't tell the people that the money would be used for Wake County disasters or other future disasters. So they felt obliged to make sure all this money was available and used, which was helpful. They also seconded a social worker intern that they had hired and were using to full time to help do help organize the case managers and make sure that the work was taking place and priorities were held. The families with the greatest needs were helped first. An example would be, suppose you had 2 families living near each other with equal amounts of damage, right? Both had a couple of kids in school. One is a 2-parent family with 2 cars living across town temporarily and ferrying the kids to school. And the other is a single parent family, maybe with a car, maybe not, trying to do the same thing. They were able to use their priorities to make sure which family got help first. Same with elderly families, families with physical disabilities, and so on. So the caseworker that they supplied and her supervisor, who was also heavily involved, made sure that we stayed on the right track. United Methodist Church North Carolina Conference provided a full-time social worker to serve as case manager, as did Salvation Army. The Federation ran a campaign, and we received a substantial donation from the Jewish community. We're still grateful for that. We received another big donation from the Episcopal Diocese. The city of Raleigh had an interesting thing happen. They had one department, their fiscal year ends June 30th. And they had a department who saw that they were going to have a $44,000 surplus at the end of the fiscal year. And they asked the city attorney if they could donate it for disaster recovery. He said, you can't do that. You have to return it to the city treasury, but you can return it with that recommendation and see what the city council does. The city council decided that that wasn't a good thing to do. So that money didn't come to us because we didn't have a big history of handling large amounts of money. In the previous years, we had a budget of a few $100s for mailing and printing at most. But the two agencies that got it did not have any experience with long-term recovery. So they immediately allied with us and made the money available, which was just as good. Now we get to the part about the labor. North Carolina Baptist Men, they were called then, now they're called Baptists on Mission, is a statewide group that does a lot of repair and rebuilds, not only here, but they travel to other states to do it. Well, this was outside of the summer hurricane season, and there hadn't been a lot of other tornadoes, so they were available. And since none of the other counties in North Carolina that were hit by the tornadoes were ready to accept them, they didn't have any case management going or what have you. They all flooded into Wake County. This was great. We had a ton of homes repaired or rebuilt by skilled people who knew what they were doing, knew how to get the materials and so on, knew how to use other volunteers. So we had other groups come and say, we want to work, we don't have any experience. The Baptist said, fine, we'll take them. We'll work, put them onto our teams so that we have safety officer watching to make sure that there are no unsafe practices. We'll have the right tools available. So this worked very, very well for us. All because we were able to get started before the other counties. The preparation was the real key here. They worked for 5 months and got a huge share of the homes that needed repair and rebuild done before other counties started calling them. Wake Interfaith Disaster Team was able to cover their costs for materials, and they provided the labor. And all because we were able to see cases earlier. In fact, usually the FEMA registration period is open for 60 days. And it's often the case that local case management doesn't start till after that because it takes so long to organize. We were seeing cases well before the end of the FEMA registration period. There were both homeowners and renters affected. The renters don't have to worry about the building repair, but they may lose their possessions. A lot of them don't have renter insurance, and they may, if they're in unfurnished premises, they may lose all their furniture too. Both homeowners and renters lost furniture and furnishings. The furnishings, linens, drapes, towels, kitchen utensils, silverware and china. All these things sometimes have to be replaced. There was a wonderful Raleigh agency called the Green Chair Project. Are any of you familiar with it? Good. they assisted 83 families with tastefully designed suites. That not just we're going to shove some furniture out the door. The people that had organized it were designers, and so they would design suites, a whole living room and bedroom and whatever, with furniture that fit well together and were tasteful. Wake Interfaith was able to cover their handling costs, and the Salvation Army provided the rental of moving trucks to actually move the furniture from their premises to the clients. Bookkeeping can be, and tax reporting can be a nightmare for, I'm sure you can imagine, especially when some donations are earmarked. Some have a tag on them that you can only be used for direct aid to clients. Others are a little more liberal, and if you have to have a copying machine or a computer or something, it's okay to use those for that. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was kind enough to assign a CPA to us for a year, as well as a bunch of volunteers doing rebuilding in the mobile home park that was so badly damaged. You may remember that. It's called Stony Brook. It's right where Capitol Boulevard and 440 intersect. That was where, in fact, where the fatalities happened in Wake County. So the upshot was Wake County was the first county in the state that had substantial damage to recover. We were able to close the operation with everything completed. We didn't run out of money. We didn't run out of volunteers. We closed the operation with no open cases and held a celebration of recovery on April 16th, 2012, a year to the day after the tornado. We were able to announce that we had coordinated the repair of 150 homes and helped 350 families. Now's a good time to stop for questions, if there are any. Apparently not.
I have a question, if I may.
Go ahead.
I can turn my camera on for just a second. There we go. So I'm fascinated listening to all this, Larry, because I've heard the term, the Interfaith Wake County Disaster Relief, Response Team, blah, blah, for so long. I had no idea of any of this. Does the team need marketing out there to let people know what they've been doing so that you can get more help if you need in terms of volunteers?
That's a good question, Amy, and I'm glad you asked it. We do best by working with other agencies and not individuals. If individuals want to help, we like to refer them to the agencies. Sometimes you can't do that. We've been fortunate so far, but let me give you an example. In Hurricane Matthew, it was so widespread. There were 23 counties or so seriously affected. Actually, a total of 50 were declared, but part of that was because it was a election year. And there weren't enough statewide volunteers to help all the counties rebuild. And so Lenore County, where Kinston is, had to actually take on the construction themselves. They were able to hire a retired contractor and bring in volunteer teams that he could supervise. He had to assess the jobs, assess the teams coming in to see if they had skills, and put time to an appropriate job. If they were skilled, he could have them framing and building a house. If they had lower skills, he'd have them painting a house or for example. And they actually had to get places for the people to stay, set up a dorm, and arrange meals, as well as locating the groups and inviting them and making sure they were happy so that they'd come next year and not spread bad word as this is not the place to go to kind of thing. Fortunately, we haven't had that in Wake. So marketing is good. The marketing that we need, if we were to, is to get other agencies involved, agencies that have skills, even agencies like the congregations. In fact, I didn't mention it, but Beth Orr sent a team to Stony Brook for a week. And it was an unskilled team, but there was a lot of cleanup that had to be done, and they did it. So I think the best answer is, in the time of disaster, it's really hard to, and perhaps to talk to organizations outside the time of disaster and talk about how we have done that. But we're trying to recruit people now for something that might not happen for 6 or 7 years and keep their interest. We tried it. We tried it with the shelter workers and so on, and we'll still do a little of that, but it doesn't seem to be the right thing to really do.
Thank you for that.
A related question, I think, is, has Wake Interfaith ever gone to other parts of the state, such as New Flooding in New Bern, or to other states to help out disasters there?
Okay, that's a great question, and the answer is in our mission statement, we said that we would respond to Wake County and keep the scope tight, but we regularly tell our members where the activities are, so that they can. Our members are not individuals; our members are groups. Beth Meyer would join, Beth Orr would join, the Catholic Charities joins, and so on. Right? If they have a team and the team wants to work, we will show them where and talk about where those activities are. In fact, we bring it up at every meeting. It's also on the, if you're curious, ncvoad.org, NCVOAD, and you look at opportunities. There's a link to it from the first page. Volunteer opportunities. You can see what work is going on right now. There's a little bit of Matthew work, some Florence work going on. The Isaias work is done, and the Dorian work should be, I think it's done too. But it takes a long time. When Matthew hit in 2016, they said it was going to be a 4-year recovery, because Florence hit 2 years later in 2018, pulled workers off of the Matthew recovery. Matthew stretched out to 5 years. And Florence, which was another storm of record, is looking like it's going to be another year or two before it's done. And so if you know some people, youth that are 16 or 18 and older, or adults that want to go for a day or go for a week, they'll be glad to take you. It was about limiting scope. Somebody else asked years ago when we were talking about founding and writing this mission statement, what about, what should we do when it's not a disaster? Should we put up storm windows for elderly people or widows? Should we build handicap ramps and so on? And I said, I really want, I was part of the faction that said, let's keep the scope really tight. I think the worst thing that could happen is we get a disaster and somebody says, we can't deploy for the disaster because we have 10 more handicap ramps to build. So we encourage our members to get involved in those activities. If they want to do it, that's fine. But our focus remains narrow by design. Should you see a project that's like that, that outside that scope that needs help, I'd be happy to direct you to organizations that might be willing to work on it. There are several, but Wake Interfaith. Okay, Ronnie.
Yeah, I remember a few years ago, Beth Meyer hosted a team of, I don't know, medical professionals that were coming from one of the major hospitals in New York to help somewhere else, and they were on their way. Are you connected with them in case that kind of need is required? Or are you aware of them?
I'm not, but we work closely with the state. The way and the way those things work is the county emergency manager, when anything is outside the scope of what he can handle, asks the state. So should something like that happen, that's the channel it would take. It would come back to us perhaps as a, can you provide housing, or can you provide a meeting place? But it would work generally through the county.
Oh, okay, I was just
and the
thinking of the
state if it needs.
professional services that they could offer.
Mhm. Whether we review ourselves and the way that we're positioned in the whole infrastructure of emergency management is the county tries to meet all the needs that it can. If it can't meet the needs, it asks the state in North Carolina Emergency Management. They have plans and people lined up, agreements for almost everything you can think of. If it's something that they can't do, either because they don't have the facilities or it's assistance that a government can't do, like helping people on private property or helping individuals, or clearing trees from private property, tarping roofs on people's houses when the trees come through the roof. Those are the kinds of things where the state leans on us. There's actually a position in the state North Carolina Emergency Management Emergency Operations Center for North Carolina VOAD, Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. And when a problem like that comes up, we need comfort dogs at the shelter to people are getting restless. You bring in some animals for the people to cuddle, or we don't have enough people to distribute water. Can you distribute water bottles with us? Those are the kinds of, they'll ask that representative, and those kinds of things will come back to us.
A related question then, based on actually a number of the previous ones. So the Wake team, do they meet regularly, or or are they sort of inactive until the next disaster and they get activated? What is the team doing, let's say, on a month-to-month basis at the
Glad you
current
should
time?
ask. Glad you should ask. We have met monthly since 2002, with two exceptions. One was the snow and ice storm, and one was the vice president and I were both out of town. And some groups do that and some don't. I am of the firm feeling that people will lose their affinity, their allegiance to the group if you stop meeting, and then when you really need them, they're not available. So we meet. We don't have 30 people in attendance. We have 5 or 6. It's key people, and occasionally well, more regularly than occasionally, someone joining from the Red Cross or someone joining from the county.
And
The reason is the classic long-term recovery failure is you have a group that's recovered from, say, Floyd in 1999, and Matthew comes through 17 years later, and the treasurers got tired of dealing with bank notices and closed the account, and he's got the, you know, the checkbook or the money in a savings account. All the records are in the closet in the box, in the shoebox in his closet, and they have to get unwound and find what people are work and what agencies are around and who are the new names and positions that people they worked with last time. We're trying to do the opposite. So we have not only do we meet monthly with a small cadre, but we send the meeting notice, the agenda, and the minutes to around 140 people that our agencies that have worked with in the past. And I hope that some of them actually read it and keep track of what we're doing. But at least I have a list of people to call on. And I have to say, they came out of the woodwork for tornadoes, and I think they will again.
And did you say, you know, with this VOAD, are there other than counties that have established a similar group?
If you look on that website, you'll see that there are about 30. Several of them have been in existence for a long time. I'm the webmaster for that site. I was attending their meetings regularly, and you know me when I'm a volunteer thing. So
Right.
I've been on their board a couple of times. I'm not currently on it, but I'm still the webmaster. And some of the organizations have been in existence since Floyd or even before. Some of them are new, but WOAD works very carefully to try and explain to them the importance of continuing to not meet regularly and to be available to activate on short notice, just as Wake Interfaith did, because not only the sooner that you can get going, the sooner you can help people and get them out of temporary housing, but in other kinds of damage, it's even more important. The flooding from Matthew and Florence it was a big problem. It happened during the summer when it was hot and steamy, and once the house gets wet, mold starts to grow. If you don't get it, they call it muck and gut, but it's getting everything out that was wet, including the drywall insulation up to 2 feet above the water line. It'll take over the house to the point that you can't repair it, you have to tear it down. And so getting a long-term recovery group going in a hurry to help these people to make sure they get the right assistance, to let them know about unscrupulous contractors is key. So what you'd love to see is every county having a group, even if it's dormant for a long time. We were dormant for 9 years, and we've been dormant for another 8. But it's better to have a dormant group than or a completely dormant group than none at all. And it's better to have a partly active group like Wake Interfaith than the dormant group.
Okay, I'm looking, we've got about 5 minutes left or so of our allotted time. And are there any other questions before we wrap it up?
Well, I have a little bit more to speak about. We did have a couple of other activities. Just to cover it, we were working with the county in 2014, and the question came up about Ebola, and we worked out a plan where if people would phone in orders to the grocery store, that we could get volunteers to pick them up wearing county supplied N95 masks. Nobody had ever heard of N95 masks at that time, but the county said, we'll get them for you, don't worry. And you can wear the masks, and pick up the order at the grocery, drop it on their porch, and then when you're well away from the porch, call the family and let them know that groceries or drug prescriptions are there on the porch. Fortunately, we never had to activate that. The but it's actually the same thing that we was set up in COVID based on that experience. It was actually turned out to be set up statewide because I brought it to people's attention. And none of you probably ever used it, but there was a number you could, website you could go to, COVID community. Tell them what that you placed the grocery order or the prescription order, or you needed pet food or PPE, and they drop it off. It was there were several families in Wake County using it. There was only one real big incident that happened, and that was in Matthew. The state has a setup called coastal region evacuation shelters, where each of the coastal counties is paired with the county inland. And if it looks like they have to evacuate the county there, they tell the people where to go. If they have their own transportation, or transport them on school buses. And Wake County is one of those reception sites. They use the high schools because it's a perfect spot. The gymnasiums make great dormitories. There's plenty of showers, plenty of food in the cafeteria, and cafeteria workers to prepare it for people. And they will run a shelter for 3 or 4 days before the Red Cross is fully activated and can take it over. Wake Interfaith was active in Wake County at the County Emergency Operations Center, providing supplies that from other voluntary agencies that they could get them from, where the county didn't have the right supplies. Thanks for the opportunity for speaking with you today, and I hope I've stirred enough interest that maybe Beth Meyer would like to send representatives to our meetings. We've actually been meeting on Zoom since COVID, so they're short and easy to attend meetings.
I got a question. If we would like to make a donation to support Wake Interfaith, how do we do it?
You write a check. And I'm sorry, I'm trying to think of the word. Okay, yes, our official mailing address is care of the Federation, 8210 Creedmoor Road.
And make it out to
Wake Interfaith Disaster Team, and just put on the envelope, Wake Interfaith Disaster Team, care of Raleigh County Jewish Federation, 8210 Creedmoor Road. I would appreciate that. It's very kind. As a matter of fact, Sean said something to me about an honorarium, and I'd actually prefer that be sent the same way. I don't need the money.
I'll figure out how to do that for you.
Well, okay. Since it's a donation, I don't see how to invoice it, but the donations are solicited on the quite out of date website at wakeidteam.org.
Okay.
You mentioned wakeidteam.org. Is that a local website that, in other words, if someone's interested in knowing about an upcoming meeting or information or even a donation, can things be done through that website?
As I said, the website doesn't have a donations link.
Okay, but it does have information on meetings.
You know, thank you for mentioning that. I should probably add a link, I think, for that.
For what?
It does have it has a contact for me. It has a contact that goes to my email address, president@wakeidteam.org.
Mm-hmm.
But I ought to put a notice about the monthly meetings.
Got it. Okay. Well, this, I think for a lot of us, you know, whether the interest is in assisting in the future or making a donation, this has been, I think, to a lot of us, eye-opening that this organization even exists and the good work that's being done and how it's assisting the community. So Larry, I appreciate your time this morning to bring our attention, all of us, our attention to what this organization and the good work that this organization is doing here in the community. So thank you for all of your efforts in that regard and your team's efforts. And I
You're very-
appreciate everybody else who has joined us this morning, and thank everyone for their time. Again, a reminder that the next brunch will be the last Sunday in February. And between now and then, there'll be additional publicity on that topic. Larry, thank you very much.
Sid, you're very kind. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today, with all of you today.
Okay,
Thank
unless
you.
any-
Thank you, Larry.
Bye-bye.